Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 17th of August 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on your screen. And there is an important announcement just before we begin with the analysis.
Are you appearing in UPSC Prelims 2021? Then it's time for you to register in Pre-Parikshan 2021, which is All India GS1 mock test, absolutely free of cost. Pre-Parikshan is a series of 4 tests. First test has already been organized and second test is due on 20th of August 2021, which will be live for 3 days. You will get the results on 23rd of August. Now, why should you compete in Pre-Parikshan? You should compete because you are going to get All India ranking. You are going to get question level analysis to identify strong and weak areas. Then you are going to get comparative analysis of top, average and your performance. And finally, you are going to get live online test discussion once the results are out. So register on ELEARN platform to give the test. All those people who have already registered themselves on ELEARN don't need any further registration. Supreme Court raises query on Tribunal Reforms Bill appears on page number 9. So the Supreme Court has challenged the government to produce material evidence to show its reason for introducing the Tribunal Reforms Bill 2021, which abolishes 9 appellate tribunals and revives provisions of an ordinance which was struck down by the Supreme Court. Now, if you look into the GS Paper 2 syllabus under Governance, Constitution and Polity, you have a line in the syllabus which says statutory, regulatory and various quasi-judicial bodies. Now, these tribunals are nothing but quasi-judicial bodies. They are not exactly judicial, but they are not exactly executive, and they are in between something. They have the power to interpret laws, but they cannot strike down the laws, and that is the thin difference between a judicial and a quasi-judicial body. And so from the perspective of GS Paper 2, especially mains examination, analysis of this issue is very, very important for us. And so in this regard, what we are going to do is that first, we will understand what tribunals are. What was the need to make tribunals in our country? When were they inserted into the Constitution of India? Where do they exactly stand with respect to High Court, Subordinate Court? And of course, they lie much beneath the Supreme Court. What are the challenges that they face currently? And the important provisions of the current bill which has been questioned by the Supreme Court. So let us now begin the discussion. So tribunals. What are tribunals? So if you have to define them in simple words, you can say that tribunals are judicial or quasi-judicial institutions established by law in India. Now there is a very, very subtle but important difference between a judiciary or a judicial body and a quasi-judicial body. So a quasi-judicial body is a non-judicial body which can interpret law. And so they are generally in the form of either an arbitration panel or tribunals. So in this case, we are going to discuss the tribunals. Now the obvious question which arises is that when we have such an extensive system of judiciary, we have lower courts, we have high courts and Supreme Court, why do we need a separate set of quasi-judicial bodies? And there are mainly 2 reasons for that. First is that they intend to provide a platform for faster adjudication as compared to traditional courts. So we already know the kind of pendency we have in our court system, right? So the pendency of cases in courts is one of the key challenges faced by judicial system. As of June 2021, there are around 91,885 cases pending for more than 30 years in different high courts in our country. So now you can imagine that these are the number of cases which have not been disposed for more than 30 years. And we have not taken into account the cases which were filed last year or in last 5 years, 10 years and 20 years. Then in Supreme Court, the situation is no better. There are around 67,000 cases pending in Supreme Court as of 1st of May 2021. And in this regard, the Law Commission of India noted that pendency in court leads to delays in the administration of justice, thereby impacting efficiency of the judicial system. Further, it noted that in certain technical cases, the traditional courts need expert knowledge for adjudication. For example, let's say there is a case of taxation, and we know how complicated taxation is. While of course our traditional judiciary goes through all the laws, but would it not be better if the cases related to taxation were dealt with people who master or are expert at handling these cases? So reinstate the same points which we have discussed. What are tribunals? They are quasi-judicial bodies established by law, which means parliament or the legislature has to establish them. And secondly, why do we need them? We need them to expedite the judicial process in our country, and we need expert advice in some or the more of the cases. And for that, we need tribunals. Now there are two questions which arise. First is that what is the legal or constitutional basis for the establishment of these tribunals? Because when we already have integrated judiciary, establishment of tribunals would definitely conflict with this system of judiciary. And so there has to be a constitutional basis for that. And that is 42nd Amendment Act, which we'll discuss. And the second question which arises is that once these tribunals are established, what is their relationship with the existing traditional system of courts, which has subordinate courts at the bottom and Supreme Court at the top? So all of us know that in 1976, Articles 323A and Article 323B were inserted in the Constitution of India through 42nd Constitutional Amendment. Now these two articles, although established the tribunal system in India, but both of these tribunals are meant for separate purposes. While Article 323A empowered the Parliament to constitute administrative tribunals, while Article 323B specified certain subjects such as taxation and land reforms for which Parliament or the state legislatures may constitute tribunals by enacting a law. Now one thing which you should note over here is that Article 323 provides only for very small number of sets on which tribunals can be provided for. But in India, you have a lot of tribunals, more than 20 to 30 tribunals. And so how is that possible? Now that has been made possible by a 2010 Supreme Court judgment when the Supreme Court clarified that the subject matters under Article 323B are not exclusive. And legislatures are empowered to create tribunals on any subject matters under their purview as specified in the 7th schedule of the Constitution of India. So basically Parliament can make tribunals on all the matters under list 1, and state legislatures of course can make tribunals on all the matters of list 2, and both of them can do the same for list 3. So that is it. Now here from the perspective of prelims examination, two things should be noted over here. First is that Article 323 gives the power to just the Parliament and not to state legislature to set up administrative tribunals. And the Parliament can do that both for centre as well as state. Whereas in the Article 323B, the power has been delegated to both Parliament and legislature as far as it lies in their legislative competence. Now most of the aspirants do not have clarity as to what is the relationship of these tribunals with High Court, Supreme Court and subordinate court and again High Courts. So first things first, there is one Supreme Court which lies above all the courts in our country, and so High Courts are directly under the Supreme Court and our subordinate courts are under the jurisdiction of their own or their state's High Court. That is clear, right? And so currently tribunals have been created both as subordinate to high courts. So there are a lot of tribunals which are located almost at the same level of subordinate courts. And then some of the tribunals have also been created as a substitute to high courts, which means they lie almost at the same level of high courts, or they are parallelly situated as compared to high court. So in this case, the appeals from the decision of the tribunal, for example, Security Appellate Tribunal, lie directly with the Supreme Court. Whereas in the case of tribunals, when they act as a subordinate to High Court, naturally their appeals are heard first by High Court, and when they are further challenged, they go to the Supreme Court. So as far as the arrangement of tribunal in our judicial system is concerned, we have placed them at two locations and not just one. So in this case, substitute to High Court, and in this case, subordinate to High Court. And this is a big problem, because when you are setting up an institution to act as a substitute to High Court or even to a subordinate court, are you able to provide that kind of autonomy, independence to these institutions so that they can act really as a replacement of High Court or even subordinate court. And this is what we are going to discuss later on. And before we move on to the challenges faced by these tribunals or tribunal system in our country, it is very, very important to trace the evolution of these tribunals in our country in a very, very succinct manner. And it is not at all important to keep these dates and these recommendations in your mind, but they are going to play a big role in making you understand the tribunal system in our country. So in 1974, Sixth Law Commission recommended setting up a separate high-powered tribunal and commission for adjudication of matters in High Court. And so of course that was aimed at reducing the amount of pendency at the High Courts. Then Swaran Singh Committee in 1976 noted that high courts were burdened with services cases by public servants, and hence it recommended setting up of administrative tribunals. An All India Appellate Tribunal for matters from labour courts, tribunals for deciding matters related to various sectors, for example revenue, land reforms and essential commodities. And it recommended that decisions of the tribunals should be subject to the scrutiny of Supreme Court. Following the recommendation of the Swaran Singh Committee in 1976, 42nd Constitutional Amendment was passed, and so it empowered the Parliament to constitute administrative tribunals and other tribunals. We have discussed that. Since 1980s, several tribunals have been established so far. One of them is Central Administrative Tribunal for Administrative Matters, Security Appellate Tribunal to hear cases against decisions of financial sector regulators, Appellate Tribunal where decisions of Central Film Certification Board could be challenged, and Appellate Tribunal for Electricity to hear tariff issues. And there are many other tribunals. But in 2017, through Finance Act 2017, the tribunal system in our country was reorganized. It was reorganized by merging tribunals based on functional similarity. And so, the number of tribunals was reduced from 26 to 19. And at the same time, the Finance Act 2017 delegated powers to the central government to make rules to provide for the qualification, appointment, removal, conditions of service for chairperson members of tribunals. And then in 2021, we have Tribunal Reforms, Rationalization and Conditions of Service Bill 2021, because of which we are discussing the whole thing today. As the bill was pending at the end of the session, an ordinance with similar provision was promulgated in April 2021. They abolished 9 tribunals and transferred their functions to existing bodies, judicial bodies, and mainly high courts. And so the main challenges which these tribunals face is right there on your face, on your screen. It is the ability of the government to tweak with their service conditions, the way they are appointed, the way they are removed, the way they are merged, the way they are created and abolished. This is not possible in case of traditional judiciary. The government cannot abolish High Court, Supreme Court, or even the local level of judiciary. And so the obvious question which arises is that when you are transferring such important judicial powers to an authority like a tribunal, are you enabling them with the same kinds of autonomy, independence and powers? You are not. And so whenever we talk about the challenges being faced by the tribunal system in our country, mainly we talk about 2 challenges. First is their quasi-judicial bodies, whether they have the same degree of independence from the executive as the courts that they replace. And the second deals with their success in achieving quicker decisions on disputes. Of course, in addition, their place within the constitutional scheme of our country has been questioned a lot. And Supreme Court has examined some of these issues and has laid out some principles. And let us now start understanding the challenges faced by tribunals by degree of independence that they have. And it is important for these tribunals to be independent because you are transferring the powers of adjudication of High Court to them. And so if they are not independent like High Court, how are they going to function? So what are the parameters on which we are going to judge any institution's independence? Of course, the selection process, its composition, term of office of its members, and administration of its tribunal. Now we understand that total insulation of judiciary from all forms of interference from the executive is a basic essential feature of the constitution, right? and tribunals are quasi-judicial. Now generally what happens in the selection process of these quasi-judicial bodies or tribunals is that there is a panel which selects the members. So for example, the selection committee for appointment as a member of Central Administrative Tribunal consists of one member from judiciary, which is a sitting judge of a Supreme Court who is nominated by Chief Justice of India, and 3 representatives of the Government of India. For example, Secretary to the Government of India, Secretary to the Government of India in Ministry of Law and Justice, and of course Chairman of Central Administrative Tribunal himself or herself. So now you can see that there is 1:3 ratio of judiciary is to executive in the selection committee. And so you can say lack of judicial dominance in the selection committee of tribunal violates the doctrine of separation of powers. And it is actually an encroachment on judicial domain, right? And not to forget that executive is often a party in litigation themselves. Then the next important challenge which the tribunals face is about the composition of the tribunals themselves. We know that tribunals contain both members from judiciary or judicial members as well as expert members or people with technical knowledge, and this is what distinguishes a tribunal from a traditional judiciary where all of the members of a bench are just judges. And so in a lot of tribunals the composition is such that the technical members are in majority, whereas the judicial members are in minority. And so when you are transferring a matter from a high court to a tribunal, this is where you breach or dilute the independence of the judiciary. So dominance of executive not just in the selection process, but also in the composition of the benches as well. Then the term of office or the conditions of office of members of these quasi-judicial bodies is very, very important. Because if government has power to remove them, to reappoint them, to make them members of other committees, then of course it is going to impinge upon the independence of these tribunals. Now short term or tenure in the office is very, very problematic one. Because by the time members achieve the required knowledge, expertise and efficiency, their term gets over. Further, it discourages meritorious candidates from applying for such positions as they may not leave their well-established careers to serve as a member for a very short period. And so in 2020, Supreme Court stated that the term of office for the chairperson and other members must be 5 years, subject to maximum age limit of 70 years for chairperson and 67 years for other members. We know that the administration of these tribunals are under some or the other ministries. So when the administration of a tribunal is being handled by a ministry, of course it does not bode as well with the independence of that organization. So this is about degree of independence, which has 4 parameters in it. This is a very crucial one, and this is the biggest challenge that they face. But the biggest reason for which the tribunals were set up was to expedite the cases or reduce the number of pendency in the High Court and the lower court. So how has been the success of these tribunals in achieving quicker decisions? But as it turns out, a lot of tribunals are facing the same issue of backlog of massive number of cases. So for example, Central Administrative Tribunal still has around 45,000 cases pending. 90,000 cases are pending in Customs, Excise, Service Tax Appellate Tribunal. Income Tax Tribunal has around 90,000 cases and 10,000 and more than 10,000 cases in Armed Forces Tribunal. And similar is the case with most other tribunals as well. And so if you compile all this data together, it is almost at the same level of that of traditional judiciary. And so the people start asking question, how good or what is the benefit we are deriving out of these tribunals? They are neither independent nor are they doing their work faster than the traditional court. And of course the biggest reason behind this pendency still continuing in tribunals is the lack of human resources, because they don't have adequate number of judges. If they have sufficient number of judges, they don't have staff to support them. And then finally comes the matter of constitutional scheme. Where do they actually fit in and how are they justified? Because the constitutional standing of tribunals has been questioned. In particular, whether the jurisdiction of high courts and Supreme Courts can be removed at all. So in 1986, Supreme Court ruled that Parliament may create an alternative to high courts provided that they have same efficacy as high courts. So you can transfer them some powers, they can replace high courts, but they need to have the same level of autonomy and independence as that of high courts. But Supreme Court made an important observation. Supreme Court stated that tribunals must not adjudicate on questions related to the constitutionality of their parent statutes. So for example, if there is an income tax tribunal, they can interpret and discuss various cases, adjudicate on various matters based on IT Act, but the tribunal cannot question the constitutional validity of the Act itself. So this is what Supreme Court has said regarding the tribunals, and this is also one of the challenges because simply they do not have the same level of efficacy as that of traditional judicial system. So what about the Tribunals Reforms Bill? What are the provisions of this bill? So the first provision is that it transfers functions of key appellate bodies from appellate bodies to either the high courts or to another existing tribunal. For example, Cinematography Act has appellate tribunal, which now has been transferred to High Court if this bill passes. Similarly, Appellate Board for Copyright Act has been transferred to Commercial Court or the Commercial Court Division of High Courts. And similarly, you can see that there is a lot of rationalization which has been done with respect to a lot of tribunals existing. Then, as we have discussed, that Finance Act 2017 did a lot of changes. It empowered the central government to notify rules on composition of search cum selection committee, qualification of tribunal members, their terms and service condition. Now the bill removes these provisions from the Finance Act. Then as far as search selection committee is concerned, it will consist of Chief Justice of India or a Supreme Court judge appointed by him, 2 secretaries nominated by central government, sitting or ongoing chairperson, or a retired Supreme Court judge or a Chief Justice of High Court, secretary of the ministry under which the tribunal is constituted. And similar is the case with the state tribunals as well. And finally, as far as term of office is concerned, the bill provides for 4-year term of office subject to the upper age of 70 for chairperson and 60 for other members. So these are the provisions which are being brought by the new bill. Now you have to let us know in the comment section whether these provisions, if implemented and passed by the parliament, are going to enhance the independence of tribunals or not. Let us now move on to the next discussion. July WPI inflation slows slightly to 11.2%. Price gains in primary articles, food and fuel and power have moderated, and there has been an uptick in manufactured products. Now, inflation is one of the very important determinants of economic growth, and not just economic growth, but the growth of UPSC aspirants as well, because just look at this instance from 2020 prelims examination where UPSC asks, consider the following statements. Statement 1, the weightage of food in consumer price index CPI is higher than that in wholesale price index known as WPI. Statement 2, the WPI does not capture changes in the prices of services which CPI does. Statement 3, Reserve Bank of India has now adopted WPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rates. Which of the statement given above are correct? And now you can easily understand how inflation becomes important for UPSC, especially the prelims stage as well. And let me assure you that this is not very easy question. It requires you to have a clear-cut understanding of CPI, WPI and how they are different. And so we will begin with that comparison, and then we will go on and understand how we calculate inflation and then what are the factors which are driving the current inflation rate in our country. And let me tell you this important coincidence. In the DNS dated 4th of January 2020, which is like 8 months before the prelims examination, we discussed this chart which has all the information it takes to solve this question. And so we'll start the discussion with the same comparison chart between WPI and CPI. So WPI is measure of inflation at the wholesale level, whereas CPI is the measure of inflation at the retail level. So you know that buyers exist both at the consumer level, which we form important part, because we don't go to the wholesale market for vegetables. We go to the local retailer or the grocery shop, whereas the business people, the people who are involved in business, have to go to the wholesale market. And so the markets exist at 2 levels, and hence the inflation exists for these 2 different markets. And so that is why the calculation of WPI is done by Ministry of Commerce and Industry, because that is not something which is impacting the consumer directly. Of course, indirectly it does. But that is an easy way to remember who calculates WPI, because it is for wholesale market, and so Commerce and Industry Ministry is the one concerned with it. Whereas the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by National Statistical Office or NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. For both of them, the base year is 2011-12 and 2012. Now, the basket of goods under the WPI is different from basket of CPI. Because under WPI, you have primary articles, manufactured products, and fuel and power. And highest weightage is given to manufactured products. Whereas if you look at CPI, the one which is consumed or centered around consumers consists of what we consumes or what we spend maximum on, which is food and beverages, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, miscellaneous, which includes services of education and healthcare, and transportation, which is also a service. But the highest weightage is given to food and beverages. So on an average, an Indian household has the maximum expenditure on food and beverages, and that is why highest weightage has been given in the CPI to this particular category. Now, when the food prices increase, which is what is happening now, will it impact WPI the same way as it does CPI? Of course no, because you can see that the highest weightage is given to manufactured product, and so the impact of increase in food items is less on WPI as compared to CPI, since the WPI provides higher weightage to manufactured products and lower weightage to food items. Whereas the impact of increase in food items would be much wider on CPI because it has the highest weightage of foodstuffs. Now, as you can clearly see, there is no health, education and transportation here, and so under WPI, there is no service sector which is included, but it forms an important part of the CPI. Under WPI, there is no inclusion of taxes, whereas CPI has the inclusion of taxes. Now, we know that RBI has been given a mandate to maintain the inflation rate between 2 to 6% or 4% plus minus 2%. Now, what is this value, whether it is WPI or CPI? Now, the government does not want the average consumer to face the inflation at a very high rate. And so it makes sense that RBI is required to maintain CPI rate of inflation of 4% with a deviation of 2%, whereas RBI does not take into account WPI. So RBI targets inflation rate, which is CPI. And so let us now go back to the Prelims 2020 question and try to solve it. The weightage of food in Consumer Price Index is higher than that in WPI, which is correct. We have seen that. WPI does not capture changes in prices of services, which CPI does, which is also correct. RBI has now adopted WPI. No, this is wrong because RBI has adopted CPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rate. And so the statement 1 and 2 are correct, leading us to the right answer A. And so often students ask about the base effect. What is this base effect? Now, to understand the base effect, we'll have to go through some calculations. You know that rate of inflation in current year depends on the rate of inflation in the previous year, because the rate of inflation is equal to prices in the current month minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by prices in the corresponding month of previous year into 100. And so, if the prices were very high in the same month last year, which means that denominator would have high value, and so you will have low rate of inflation because of base effect. Similarly, if the prices were very low, unusually low in the same month last year, your denominator will be low and hence your rate of inflation will be high because of the base effect. And so let us understand these two scenarios. Under scenario 1, let's say the price of an item A in 2019 May is 100 rupees, and in May 2020 it is 150 rupees, and in May 2021 they have increased to 200 rupees. So how are you going to calculate the inflation? For the first year, inflation would be calculated for May 2020. It would be done in a way by applying this formula. Prices in current month, which is 150, minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year, which is 100, divided by prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by 100, which is 50 by 100, which is 50% inflation. And similarly, if you apply the same formula, it comes out to be 33.33%, because then you are going to subtract 150 from 200 and divide it by 150 into 100. Again, to show you how the base effect changes the whole game, you have the same starting point and the same ending point, but the middle point is different. So let's say for an item B, it starts at 100 just like item A, but in May 2020 it was 110. So rate of inflation was 10%. In May 2021, the prices have gone up to 200, just as the way item A has gone. But item A has 33.33% inflation rate, whereas item B has 81.81% inflation rate, just owing to the base effect, because the base would be 110 in this case and 150 in this case. And so this is what is known as base effect. And so let us now quickly understand the reasons behind the inflation in our country right now. And there are 4 reasons behind that. Imported inflation, increase in certain food items prices, increase in services prices, and low base effect, which we just understood. So increase in global commodity prices such as crude oil, edible oil, all of us are feeling this particular instance of higher crude prices. And so since most of the things are being transported on crude oil, and so of course the increase in the prices of petrol and diesel would be reflected in everything else. Similarly, there are certain food items which are getting expensive, for example, eggs, edible oils, fruits and pulses. Similarly, the prices of health, transport and communication sector services have gone up, and we know that services are included in CPI. And due to lockdown last year, the prices of most of the goods had declined because of the low demand. And so that is why we have low base effect, which would reflect in higher inflation prices. Also at the same time, aspirants often come across such terms such as headline and core inflation. Now, headline inflation simply refers to the inflation in the CPI or even the WPI, covering all the categories of goods and services. So that is complete CPI and WPI. But on the other hand, the core inflation excludes the volatile categories such as food, fuel, in order to measure the increase in the prices of goods and services in general. So you know that due to various reasons, some or the other component of CPI and WPI would deviate from the general trend. So for example, if the rate of inflation in general is low, but for let's say sudden reduction in rainfall, the prices of vegetables shoot up. But that is quite temporary, but that will take up the overall inflation trend high in that particular month. But that is not what is the general trend, and that general trend is called the core inflation. And so a drastic fall in the food and fuel prices can bring down the headline inflation by a large extent. However, the core inflation may remain unaffected. So don't get confused. RBI right now is targeting CPI headline rate of inflation, which is the complete CPI and not the core inflation. Now, a debate which has cropped up in last 2 years is that what should be actually targeted by RBI, whether it is headline, which is what is RBI doing right now, or should it resort to targeting the core inflation, because which is what is the normal trend. And so in this regard, Economic Survey has highlighted that the sole focus on CPI headline rate of inflation may not be appropriate on account of number of reasons. And accordingly, it has recommended that a greater focus on core inflation is warranted because of 4 specific reasons. First, headline inflation may take place due to volatility in prices of crude oil and food commodities over which RBI has no control. For example, failure of monsoon, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply side bottlenecks usually lead to increase in food prices. And accordingly, RBI changes its monetary policy, which is going to have no impact on this particular inflation. Similarly, increase in crude oil prices, the import of crude oil prices is not connected with the monetary policy of RBI. But RBI is changing its monetary policy as a result of these increase in prices. Then second, most of the time inflation in food commodities is transitory and may not require any policy change by RBI. It could be just a 1-month phenomena. But RBI comes up with a policy for 3 months, and so that could not be justified. Third, if the RBI tries to control inflation due to volatility in prices of food commodities, it can prove to be counterproductive. For example, to control inflation, rate of interest would increase, which will lead to decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which will result in economic slowdown. And lastly, to measure inflation correctly, weightage must be assigned to different categories of commodities depending upon their share in the household expenditure. Higher the share, higher should be the weightage. And the share of food commodities in household expenditure has declined since 2011-12. Yet the CPI gives a weightage of around 45% to food commodities, as we have already seen. So I hope with this discussion, it was clear to you as to what the inflation, especially the WPI and CPI differences, headline and core differences, and how the base effect impacts the rate of inflation. Let us now move on to the question of the day. The message from the IPCC report appears on page number 6 as a lead article. Now in this article, the two authors highlight the important takeaways from the recent report of IPCC, the Working Group 1 contribution to the 6th assessment report titled as Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis. So the IPCC has released the first report, which basically talks about the evidences which we are getting across the world, which undoubtedly reflect on the scale of global warming and climate change which has already taken place across the world. Now if you look at the GS paper 1 syllabus, it says important geophysical phenomena such as earthquake, tsunami, volcanic activity, cyclone, geographical features, their location, and changes in critical geographical features including water bodies and ice caps. So basically it talks about the impact of climate change on geographical features. So of course it is very difficult for an author to summarize the complete report in an editorial. And so what we have done is that we have compiled the important takeaways from the report and what it says about the impact of climate change on South Asian region, on mountain regions, on Himalayas, on oceans, on polar regions, and on urban areas. And so we are going to discuss them one by one. But to start with, the IPCC, which provides regular assessments of scientific basis of climate change, its impact and future risks and options for adaptation and mitigation. The IPCC reports are also a key input into international climate change negotiations. It was created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP. For preparing the reports, IPCC does not conduct its own research. It is very important, but rather it relies on the researches being done across the world by various scientists and agencies. And so it basically compiles the data which is already being created, which is already being published in the journals. So what does the 6th assessment report talks about? The 6th report shows that there is unambiguous and unequivocal evidence that human influence has warmed the climate. The fact that human influence has caused the global warming and hence the climate change is undeniable. There are widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere and biosphere that have occurred and are occurring, and they are going to occur for some time. Recent changes across the climate system are unprecedented over many thousands of years. So the kind of climate change that we are observing has not taken place in last many thousand years. So all across the world, the extremities of the climate and the weather which we are observing is clear-cut result of global warming. Global surface temperature is now higher by around 1.07 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial level. And this temperature will continue to increase until at least the mid-century under all emission scenario considered. So even if we include the commitments made across the world under Paris Climate Deal, then also the temperature will still continue to rise. And so the global warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless and until deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other GHGs are done in the coming decades. Report also notes that the carbon dioxide has been and will continue to be the dominant cause of global warming under all GHG emission scenarios. So, two important takeaways: the temperature has risen and will continue to rise, and we are going to breach the commitments made under Paris Climate Deal, and carbon dioxide is a major factor and will continue to remain the major factor. What about the region in which we lie, the region of our interest? That is the South Asian region. So the report says that the South and Southeast Asian monsoon has weakened in second half of the 20th century, and the dominant cause of this decreased precipitation is anthropogenic aerosol forcing. Both annual and summer monsoon precipitation will increase during the 21st century with enhanced interannual variability, and so we need to be prepared for higher incidence of flooding going forward. So this is the increased frequency and intensity of disasters that we talk about. Heat waves and humid heat stress will be more intense and frequent during the 21st century. So these are the three takeaways for South Asian region. But what about the mountainous regions? So first and foremost, the report says that the freezing level height in mountain areas is projected to rise and will alter snow and ice conditions. So this is no surprise, we have observed the increment in the snow line in our Himalayan region as well. Then warming has occurred in Himalayas, Alps and Central Andes and has increased with altitude. So as we go higher in mountains, the warming also increases, and that is known as elevation dependent warming. And this has the potential to alter the snow line much more rapidly than other factors. Then mountain glaciers are retreating very rapidly. Of course, there are few exceptions, but majority of glaciers are retreating across the world. And so in the coming future, the glaciers will continue to lose mass at least for several decades, even if global temperatures are stabilized. The global warming induced earlier onset of spring snowmelt and increased melting of glaciers have contributed to seasonal changes in stream flow in low elevation mountain catchments. So specifically among mountains, what is the impact on Himalayas? Snow cover has reduced since 21st century and glaciers have thinned, retreated and lost mass. Karakoram glaciers have either slightly gained mass or are in an approximate balanced state. So these are the exceptions when we talked about the mountains. Snow-covered areas and snow volumes will decrease during the 21st century. Snow line elevations will rise. Glacier mass is likely to decline with greater mass loss in higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios, and rising temperature and precipitation can increase the occurrence of glacial lake outburst floods and landslides over moraine-dammed lakes. And this is what has happened in Uttarakhand early this year. Global warming directly linked with increased instances of disasters. Then what about oceans? Marine heat wave will increase in frequency in 21st century. Warming will decrease ocean oxygen concentrations and deoxygenation will persist over coming centuries. Mean sea level is projected to rise over 21st century due to continuing deep ocean heat uptake and mass loss from ice sheets. Majority of coastal locations have a regional sea level rise within ±20% of the projected global mean sea level change. Ocean acidification has increased globally in the past decade. As far as Indian Ocean is concerned, it has warmed faster than the global average. Now as far as polar regions are concerned, annual mean surface temperatures and precipitation will continue to increase in both polar regions. Mean precipitation and precipitation intensity will increase in the polar regions. Glaciers have lost mass in all polar regions and will continue to lose mass in coming decades, and that is even when the global temperatures are stabilized. Both major ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctic, have been losing mass since at least 1990s, with pace accelerating in past 10 years. Now as far as urban areas are concerned, they are set to turn warmer than their surrounding rural areas due to urban heat island effect. Urbanization is clearly altering the water cycle. It is generating increased precipitation over the downwind of the cities. Rapid urbanization is also inducing phenomena such as urban dryness island, which refers to conditions where lower humidity values are observed in cities relative to more rural conditions, and to slower wind speed compared to adjacent suburbs and countryside. Warmer climate is expected to increase surface ozone over polluted regions, and climate change will be more pronounced in extreme air pollution episodes in heavily polluted environments. As far as coastal cities are concerned, both sea levels and air temperature will rise in coastal settlements, and combination of extreme sea level increase by both sea level rise and storm surge and rainfall river flow will actually increase the probability of flooding in the cities which are situated along the coast. So these are the important takeaways from the 6th assessment report, and this is the first report. Now the terms which have been used in this particular discussion will be discussed later on as and when they appear in the newspaper. For example, urban heat island impact, elevation dependent warming, heat waves, but they have also been discussed in our DNS in last 1 year. But it is important from the perspective of prelims examination to keep at least these points in mind, because they can be put as an option in one of the questions. Let us now move on to the last discussion. This last article for discussion appears on page number 7, Case for Third-Party Funding, which advocates about institutionalizing third-party funding in arbitration. Now from the perspective of civil services examination, this particular concept is not very important, but it is important for us to at least understand the concept. As and when government talks about or takes an initiative to institutionalize this kind of funding, we are going to discuss that in detail. But what is third-party funding? Now, third-party funding in arbitration or litigation is a concept where an unrelated party to a dispute finances the legal cost of one of the parties. So, for example, there is a legal battle going on between a party A and B. A is financially very poor, they are not able to finance the cost of the case against B, whereas B is very wealthy. The lack of financial resources on behalf of A makes it very easy for B to win the case even when the legal backing is very poor. So, a likely scenario is that A will lose the case, but then we have a C, which is ready to finance A to fight the case against B. And so whatever damages which shall be claimed by A will be divided between C and A. And so the investor, in this case C, receives part of the damages owed or recovered by the financed party, which is A, in exchange for the funding. This form of funding is widely used in commercial arbitration and various litigations around the world. Now, why author says we need this in India is because of the level of poverty which we have in our country. Poverty means lack of access to financial resources, means delay in justice. And when the justice is delayed, it is almost as if the justice is denied. But at the same time, we have a lot of people who have a lot of money who can finance parties like A to file cases against B. As of now, this system is not illegal in India, but there is no law which actually provides for the regulation of third-party funding in arbitration, and author actually advocates the same. Let us now move on to the question of the day.